Imagine a world full of promise. A world with vast forests, wide rivers, and land that seemed to go on forever. This was America in the 1700s. People from England and other parts of Europe crossed the great Atlantic Ocean to start new lives here. They were called colonists. They built towns and cities. They farmed the rich soil. They had their own governments, called colonial assemblies. The colonists felt they had a right to govern themselves in their own lands. In 1765, the British Parliament did something that made the colonists very angry. They passed a law called the Stamp Act. This law was not about postage stamps for mailing letters. It was a tax on all sorts of paper. The colonists were furious. It wasn't just about the money. It was about a big idea. No taxation without representation. People organized. They formed groups called the Sons of Liberty. They didn't just write angry letters, they took to the streets. Finally, in 1766, Parliament gave in. They repealed the Stamp Act. But Parliament also passed another law on the same day, called the Declaratory Act. The fight was not over. Parliament passed new taxes, called the Townshend Acts. To make sure the colonists paid up, the king sent soldiers to America. The colonists saw them not as protectors, but as an occupying army. On the cold, snowy night of March 5, 1770, that mood exploded into violence. The soldiers fired their muskets directly into the crowd of unarmed civilians. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead or dying in the snow. Paul Revere, a silversmith, created a famous engraving of the shooting. It spread across the colonies, fueling outrage against the British. By 1773, the British East India Company, a pillar of the British economy, was on the verge of collapse, burdened by 17 million pounds of unsold tea. To rescue this corporate giant, Parliament passed the Tea Act. This was a clever bailout, not a new tax. It granted the company a monopoly, allowing them to sell tea cheaper than even smuggled Dutch tea. The catch? The tea still carried the unpopular Townshend tax, a constant reminder of Parliament's power. The colonists saw right through the scheme. The lower price was irrelevant. The principle was everything. They viewed the Tea Act as a Trojan horse, a tactic to make them accept Parliament's right to tax them without representation. The act also undercut colonial merchants, key figures in the resistance. Opposition flared across the colonies. In Philadelphia and New York, patriots successfully forced the tea ships to return to England without unloading their cargo. But in Boston, Royal Governor Thomas Hutchinson stood firm. When 3 tea ships, the Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver, arrived, he refused to let them leave. A tense standoff ensued. By law, the ships had 20 days to unload their cargo. If they failed, customs officials would seize the tea, and the tax would be collected by force. The deadline was December 17th. The clock was ticking. The people of Boston held massive town meetings at the Old South Meeting House, desperately seeking a peaceful way out. Led by patriots like Samuel Adams, they pleaded with Governor Hutchinson to send the ships back. But the governor, whose own sons were consignees for the tea, refused to budge. With all legal avenues exhausted, Adams declared, "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." It was the signal. That night, December 16th, men from the Sons of Liberty disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians, a symbolic choice to declare a new American identity. For 3 hours they worked with quiet efficiency, smashing open 342 chests of tea and dumping every last leaf into Boston Harbor. This was no chaotic riot, it was a disciplined act of protest. The Boston Tea Party was an unmistakable challenge to British authority that would change the course of history. When news of the Boston Tea Party reached London, King George III and Parliament were absolutely furious. In 1774, Parliament passed the Intolerable Acts. The first closed the busy port of Boston to all trade. The colonists could no longer elect many of their own officials. The king would now appoint them. A new quartering act allowed soldiers to be quartered in private buildings, homes, and barns. Instead of crushing the spirit of Boston, the Intolerable Acts did the exact opposite. They united the colonies. Far from isolating one rebellious colony, the king's fury had brought all 13 colonies closer together. In September of 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. For the very first time, leaders from across America were coming together to decide their future. The men who met were some of the most important leaders in America: George Washington, Samuel Adams, John Adams, and Patrick Henry. Some were radical and wanted confrontation. Others were moderate and hoped for peaceful solution. They decided to do both. First, they wrote a polite but firm letter to King George asking him to repeal the harsh laws, but they also prepared for the worst. The Congress advised the colonies to begin training their own militias, Minutemen ready to fight at a minute's notice. Across the Atlantic, the pleas of the First Continental Congress fell on deaf ears. King George III, viewing the colonists' demands not as grievances to be addressed, but as a challenge to his authority, refused to yield. In a decisive speech to Parliament, he dismissed their petition and officially declared the American colonies to be in a state of open rebellion. This was no longer a political dispute. It was an act of treason in the eyes of the Crown. In Boston, the British military governor, General Thomas Gage, received intelligence that the colonists had amassed a significant cache of weapons and gunpowder in the town of Concord. Under the cloak of darkness on April 18, 1775, Gage dispatched 700 of his elite troops on a secret mission. Their orders were to march the 16 miles to Concord, seize the munitions, and arrest key Patriot leaders. The operation was meant to be a swift, surgical strike to disarm the rebellion before it could truly begin. But the Patriots had their own intelligence network. As the British troops began to move, a prearranged signal was given. 2 lanterns hung in the steeple of Boston's Old North Church, indicating the soldiers were crossing the Charles River by boat. Silversmith Paul Revere and tanner William Dawes set off on separate routes into the countryside. Riding through the cold night, they risked capture and death to spread the alarm, their urgent warning echoing from town to town. "The regulars are out." The message spread like wildfire. Church bells pealed and signal guns fired, waking farmers, blacksmiths, and merchants from their beds. These were the Minutemen, volunteer militias who had pledged to be ready at a moment's notice. Leaving their homes and families, they grabbed their personal muskets and powder horns, converging on village greens along the road to Concord. They were ordinary citizens, about to confront the disciplined might of the British Empire. Just as the sun began to rise, the British advance guard marched into the town of Lexington. There, on the village green, they were met by a small, defiant band of about 70 Minutemen. Vastly outnumbered, their captain, John Parker, a veteran of the French and Indian War, knew they stood little chance in a fight. His goal was a show of resolve. He famously ordered his men, "Stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." A British officer ordered the colonists to lay down their arms and disperse. In the tense and confusing moments that followed, a single shot rang out. To this day, no one knows for certain which side fired it, but that one shot shattered the morning quiet and broke the fragile peace. The disciplined British regulars, perhaps startled or acting on instinct, unleashed a devastating volley into the militia's ranks. The brief skirmish was over in minutes, leaving 8 Americans dead on the green. The first blood had been spilled. The British pushed on to Concord, but found that most of the military supplies had already been moved. As they began to search the town, the number of colonial militiamen swelled into the hundreds, gathering on the high ground overlooking the North Bridge. When the British fired on them, killing 2, the colonial commander, Major John Buttrick, gave a fateful order. "Fire, fellow soldiers, for God's sake, fire!" For the first time, Americans were ordered to fire upon the King's troops. The volleys from the Minutemen were withering, and the stunned British regulars broke and fled back to the main force. The march back to Boston turned into a harrowing 16-mile gauntlet of death. Thousands of Minutemen, now employing guerrilla tactics, fired relentlessly on the exposed British column from behind stone walls, trees, and buildings. The orderly retreat devolved into a desperate running battle. Only the arrival of 1,000 British reinforcements saved the column from complete annihilation. By the time the exhausted survivors limped back to the safety of Boston, nearly 300 of their comrades were killed, wounded, or missing. The day that began with a secret mission had ended in open warfare. The shot heard round the world had been fired and the American Revolution had begun. In the spring of 1775, with the smoke of Lexington and Concord still lingering, the colony's most brilliant minds gathered in Philadelphia. The Second Continental Congress convened not as petitioners, but as the de facto government of a nation on the brink of war. The mood was a volatile mix of apprehension and resolve. Delegates debated furiously. Some still hoped for reconciliation, but others, led by the fiery John Adams, argued that a unified military response was essential for survival. Out of these debates came their most critical decision: the creation of a continental army and the appointment of its commander. The choice fell upon a tall, imposing Virginian planter, George Washington. His selection was a stroke of political genius. As a Southerner, he would bind the powerful Southern colonies to the rebellion that had begun in New England. He possessed crucial military experience and attended Congress in his full military uniform, a silent but powerful statement of his commitment. He accepted the command with humility, but beneath it lay a steely determination. Even before Washington reached the front, the raw courage of the colonial militia was tested. Outside Boston, at the Battle of Bunker Hill, Patriots faced the disciplined might of the British regulars. Ordered to hold their fire, they unleashed devastating volleys, repelling 2 assaults before their ammunition ran out. The battle was a tactical loss, but a tremendous moral victory. When Washington arrived to take command, he found the victors in a state of chaos, a sprawling, disorganized encampment. His monumental task had just begun: to forge this passionate mob into a professional fighting force. While Washington built an army, another battle was fought for the people's hearts and minds. In January 1776, a political earthquake struck in the form of a pamphlet, Common Sense. Its author, Thomas Paine, didn't just argue against British policies, he attacked the very foundation of monarchy. Written in plain language that anyone could understand, it was a clarion call for independence. The pamphlet sold hundreds of thousands of copies, read aloud in taverns and public squares, galvanizing public opinion and transforming the struggle into a revolution. The momentum was now unstoppable. The arguments of common sense echoed in the halls of Congress. On June 7, 1776, Virginia's Richard Henry Lee introduced a momentous resolution: that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. The die was cast. The path was now clear. The final, irrevocable step was about to be taken, a formal declaration that would announce the birth of a new nation to the world.
The year is 1778. The American Revolution has been raging for 3 long years. The Continental Army, led by George Washington, is tired. They are often hungry. But then, something amazing happens. A powerful friend decides to help. That friend is France. The French king, Louis XVI, had been watching the war from across the Atlantic Ocean. He did not like the British. The American victory at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777 proved that the colonists could actually win, so France signed a treaty. They promised to send ships, soldiers, money, and supplies to help the Americans. This was a game changer. After the French joined the war, the British changed their plan. For years they had focused on the northern colonies. They had captured big cities like New York City and Philadelphia, but they could not crush George Washington's army. So the British leaders in London looked at a map. They decided to try something new. They would move the war to the south. In late 1778, the new strategy began. A British force sailed from New York and easily captured Savannah, Georgia. Next, the British set their sights on an even bigger prize, Charleston, South Carolina. Charleston was the most important port city in the South. In 1780, the British sent a huge force under General Sir Henry Clinton. They surrounded the city by land and by sea. The British turned their attention south, anticipating a swift victory. They believed the colonies were teeming with loyalists ready to flock to the king's banner. But the army under Lord Cornwallis soon found the South was not what they expected. The war here became a different, more intimate, and far more savage kind of fight. It devolved into a nasty, brutal civil war, pitting neighbor against neighbor. Small bands of patriot militia, men who knew every hidden path, would appear out of the swamps and forests. They'd attack a British supply wagon, then disappear back into the wilderness. For the British regulars, it was like fighting ghosts in an alien landscape. Out of this struggle, legends were born. Men like Francis Marion, known as the Swamp Fox. The name was supposedly given by a frustrated Banastra Tarleton, who declared, "The devil himself could not catch him." Marion and his small band of fighters would hide in the swampy lowlands of South Carolina, waiting for the perfect moment. They would strike quickly and silently, disrupting communication lines and causing chaos for the British, then vanish before the Redcoats could even organize a response. This constant harassment bled the British army of men, supplies, and morale. They could win battles, but they couldn't control the countryside, making it impossible to secure their gains. Frustrated, the British responded with harsh measures. They burned farms and homes of people they suspected were patriots, hoping to terrorize the population into submission. But this brutal policy was a grave miscalculation. Instead of breaking their will, it only fueled their anger, driving many neutral settlers directly into the Patriot camp. One British officer, Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton, became especially feared. After a battle at Waxhaws, his legacy of cruelty was sealed. Tarleton's men were accused of killing American soldiers who were trying to surrender. The Waxhaws massacre became a Patriot rallying cry, meaning no mercy would be given. The war had become a personal vendetta. After the disaster at Charleston, the Continental Congress sent their best general after George Washington himself. His name was Nathanael Greene. Greene came up with a brilliant plan. He would not try to win battles, he would try to win the war. Greene's strategy was simple: run away. One part of Greene's army, led by the tough General Daniel Morgan, won a stunning victory at the Battle of Cowpens in January 1781. This started a famous race across North Carolina to the Dan River. Greene's men marched hard with Cornwallis's army right behind them. When the Americans got there, they were able to cross safely into Virginia. Lord Cornwallis was frustrated. After a grueling campaign in the Carolinas, and against orders from his commander in New York, he marched his army north into Virginia. He was convinced he could sever critical American supply lines. He chose a small tobacco port on a peninsula called Yorktown. The location seemed ideal, offering a deep water port that could be easily supplied and defended by the powerful British Royal Navy. In Yorktown, Cornwallis believed he would be safe. He began constructing defensive positions, confident in his location. This confidence was rooted in a simple fact of the war: the dominance of the British Royal Navy. He expected the powerful British Royal Navy to be able to sail in at any time to bring him more supplies or to rescue his army if he got into trouble. The sea was his lifeline. Hundreds of miles north, George Washington, who was camped with his army outside New York City, saw a golden opportunity. He and his French counterpart, the Comte de Rochambeau, had been planning a major attack on the British there, but Cornwallis's move presented a tantalizing alternative. Then he got some very important news that would change the course of the entire war. A large French fleet commanded by Admiral de Grasse was sailing from the Caribbean not to New York but directly to the Chesapeake Bay. The fleet consisted of 28 ships of the line, but it was only available for a few crucial weeks. Washington realized that if the French Navy could block the entrance to the bay, they could sever Cornwallis's connection to the sea. The British general's greatest strength, his naval support, could be turned into his greatest weakness. They could trap Cornwallis. The decision was made instantly. The attack on New York was off. Secrecy was paramount. Washington employed elaborate deceptions, making the British think they were preparing for a long siege of New York. With the British distracted, Washington and Rochambeau were secretly and swiftly marching their armies south. They covered over 400 miles in just a few weeks, a remarkable feat of logistics. By the end of September, the trap was sprung. Admiral de Grasse's fleet had arrived and driven off a British relief fleet at the pivotal Battle of the Chesapeake. On land, the Allied armies converged on the peninsula. Their combined force of about 17,000 American and French soldiers had arrived at Yorktown and completely surrounded Cornwallis's trapped army of 9,000. Outnumbered and with his back to a hostile sea, the stage was set. Lord Cornwallis looked out from his defenses at Yorktown and saw a sea of enemy soldiers. He was surrounded on land by a massive Franco-American army and blocked at sea by the powerful French fleet. George Washington gave the order to begin the siege. Day and night, the big guns of the French and American armies pounded the British positions. On the night of October 14, 1781, they launched a surprise attack. American soldiers, led by the young and brilliant Alexander Hamilton, attacked in a fierce hand-to-hand fight with bayonets. On October 17, Cornwallis sent a lone British officer with a white flag to discuss surrender. 2 days later, on October 19, 1781, the British Army marched out of Yorktown to formally surrender. The peace talks in Paris took many months. The American negotiators had a clear goal. They wanted Great Britain to formally recognize the United States of America as a free and independent country. But they also wanted more. They wanted Britain to give the new nation generous borders, all the land from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. Finally, on September 3, 1783, the treaty was signed. It was called the Treaty of Paris. It was a huge victory for the United States. In November 1783, the last British soldiers evacuated New York City. George Washington triumphantly marched his army into the city they had lost 7 years earlier. The war was officially, finally, completely over. How did a small group of colonies defeat the most powerful empire on Earth? On paper, it was an impossible fight. Great Britain possessed the world's most formidable navy and a professional army. The colonists had a patchwork militia and a cause. Yet, against all odds, this David defeated the global Goliath. The Americans won for several key reasons. First and foremost was their motivation. They were fighting on their own land for their own homes and for a powerful idea: liberty. This home field advantage meant they knew the terrain and had shorter supply lines, while Britons stretched precariously across the Atlantic. For many British soldiers and their hired Hessian mercenaries, it was a job far from home. For the Patriots, it was a fight for their very existence. Second, the Americans had outstanding leadership. George Washington was the perfect commander. Patient and determined, his true genius was holding the army together through incredible hardships, like the brutal winter at Valley Forge. His character inspired a loyalty and confidence that was the revolution's indispensable glue. He kept the cause alive when all seemed lost. Third, foreign help was absolutely critical. The Americans probably could not have won without France. Eager for revenge against their old rival, the French saw a chance to weaken Great Britain. The stunning American victory at Saratoga convinced them to commit fully, providing money, troops, and their powerful navy. The French fleet's victory at the Battle of the Chesapeake was the key that unlocked the final victory at Yorktown. In the end, the American Revolution was won through a combination of patriot passion, brilliant leadership, crucial foreign aid, and British blunders. British generals consistently underestimated colonial resolve and failed to adapt their tactics. Supplying a war across an ocean proved a logistical nightmare that contributed heavily to their defeat. The result was the birth of a new kind of nation, a republic founded on the idea that ordinary people could govern themselves. This American experiment sent shockwaves across the world, challenging the old order of monarchies and inspiring future generations to fight for their own freedom. The world would never be the same.